Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, I'm Lee Epstein. I'm with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. The webinar is, as you know, about clean water and healthy communities, and really what we're talking about today is how we can improve the funding of green infrastructure in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We have a particular instrument that we're going to be talking about today called an environmental impact bond. And we're excited to share that information with you and hope that some of you will actually be applying to participate in our program. What the program is an opportunity for up to 4 municipalities from across the watershed, that is at least in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, to obtain our assistance to work on their green infrastructure programs and on improving the financing of those programs through the use of environmental impact bonds. We will assist you, and hopefully we'll get to a good place where you can actually put some of this good stuff in the ground. So that's the idea of the project. And let me, if I may, introduce this webinar. First thing I got to do, if we can make this happen, there we go, is be a lawyer. And we're going to just show you this disclaimer. I am not going to read it like the guys on TV do with very fast staccato kind of a speech. But basically what it says is that we will help up to 4 municipalities. We will not act as their financial advisors or their legal advisors. They have to get their own. But we will try to help them through this process. And that's the disclaimer in a nutshell. But you're free to read it, and it's on our website as well. So again, I'm going to introduce myself and my colleagues today. I'm the old guy at the top. The handsome guy in the middle is Todd Appel from Quantified Ventures, and the attractive woman is Carolyn DuPont, also from Quantified Ventures. And the 3 of us will serve as your presenters today. Also in the room with me is someone who some of you have already met and talked to, John Campagna. John is going to be collecting the questions along the way and helping us be ready to answer some of them. So we've got a full team here. Our coordinator of the webinar itself is Danielle Hodgkin. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce myself. I've been here for about 25 years at CBF. We have a 50-year-old organization, so I've been here about half as long as the organization's been around. My first introduction to the Bay was as a counselor at a camp across the Bay and the eastern shore of Maryland. So that was a very long time ago, but it was a great way to get introduced to Chesapeake Bay issues. Todd, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, Lee, thank you. So I'm Todd Appel. I'm a director with Quantified Ventures. We're very excited to be working with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation on this important initiative, and thanks everyone for attending the webinar today. Quantified Ventures is a pay-for-success transaction coordinator. So we design and structure pay-for-success transactions, sometimes known as social impact bonds or environmental impact bonds. And we recently worked with the DC Water and Sewer Authority in structuring an environmental impact bond for their green infrastructure program. And that was one of the inspirations for this initiative with CBF. So thanks, Lee.
And Carolyn, how about you?
Great. Yeah, my name is Carolyn DuPont. Also very excited to be working on this project and to be sharing more information with you all today. I'm an associate director with our team and work on environmental impact bonds across a range of environmental issue areas, and have really enjoyed getting to know the Chesapeake Bay area through this project.
Terrific. All right. Well, now that you know a little bit about us, we would like to find out a little bit about you. So we're going to introduce a quick poll if we could, and if you all would participate, that'd be terrific. Basically, what we want to know is what's your role or what could your role be with respect to green infrastructure deployment in a particular jurisdiction? And if you all just vote, whatever you are along that list of attributes or types of people, that would be great. We'll know a little bit more about whom we're talking to. We'll give you about 30 seconds here. Great. Well, thank you very much. It looks like a pretty wide range and pretty even range, actually, of people that are participating among those professions and interests. So that's really terrific. Well, why don't we get started? I want to talk about what our agenda is today. Basically, at the first part of the program here, we want to talk about what an environmental impact bond is and what this program is all about. And actually, even before that, we'll talk about green infrastructure for a little bit. Second, why should you as jurisdictions out there apply for this exciting opportunity? And then finally, we'll end with how that application process will proceed. So also along the way, if anybody has questions that they want to pose to us, up in the upper left, top left of your screen, there's a small question and answer box. So if something pops into your head as we're speaking, feel free to send us a question. My colleague John here again is going to be collecting those, and we'll try to answer questions a couple of times through the webinar. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is green infrastructure. And it's just sort of a cute little cartoon, but you know, green infrastructure is, we think, useful to all kinds of people, and in this case, critters, or sort of critters, for different reasons. But we think it fulfills and fills an interesting niche here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. It's useful for community attractiveness. It's useful for reducing localized flooding. It's useful for improving climate resiliency. And of course, the main reason that we're interested in it is that it's useful for reducing the pollution from stormwater runoff. And so let's talk a little bit about what green infrastructure is, just for this additional slide here. Basically, green infrastructure that we're talking about here is a stormwater practice that either uses nature or mimics the natural process that goes on in nature to treat runoff. Usually those practices infiltrate that water, that polluted stormwater, through plants and mulch and soil. And what results is a lot cleaner product than what would normally run off of streets and impervious surfaces, streets and roofs, driveways, parking lots. And there are all kinds of practices that are available for green infrastructure. Again, from green roofs to permeable parking, like is in this image here, bioinfiltration trenches and bioinfiltration practices like the picture on the left, or rain gardens. And these can be in a variety of settings. In the lower right, you see that kind of a practice is occurring in a parking lot in Stafford County, Virginia. So that's the set of practices. That's what we want to try to benefit through the use of this financial instrument. That's what we want to try to accelerate the use of through this particular program and project that we've got going. So you know, there are a number of barriers to, well, actually, this might be a good chance for another poll. So let's do another poll here. If you don't mind participating, folks, this will give us a sense as to where you're coming from. What are your jurisdiction's biggest challenges in deploying green infrastructure? If you'll just give it a shot, maybe another 15, 20 seconds, and we'll report back here. All right, thank you very much. Well, it looks like financing is the winner, although I wouldn't say this isn't a contest, but that's definitely one of the barriers that we've seen in the past and people have told us about in our visits with them. At the top of this slide is perceived project risk, and by that, what we mean is green infrastructure is something that's been around for a little while. But it has not necessarily been taken to scale. Communities have started to implement green infrastructure practices, and in a few communities in the nation, they've done it in a fairly big way. But that's not been the common practice. So municipalities that are dealing with stormwater problems are used to dealing with them in a certain way. The engineering and consulting community is used to dealing with it in a certain way, and they know that certain kinds of practices perform a certain way. Green infrastructure is a little bit different, and it's not as certain an outcome. So there's this perceived risk that needs to be resolved, and sometimes that prevents communities from really employing these practices in a broad way. The complexity issue is related to that. Getting these projects permitted sometimes is a problem. Dealing with the state regulatory agencies to allow them to be put in and receive a particular amount of credit. These are all complicating factors. And then finally, what we call the lack of standard financing, and which our poll just now, our short little poll of just the folks on the webinar show, is that people are worried about being able to finance this stuff, about being able to find the money to put it into the ground. What they're doing, what many communities do now, is they count on grant funds for a good portion of the few green infrastructure projects that communities are able to put in. And it's just not a sustainable model. That's a tough way to proceed over the course of the next year or the next 5 years if you're talking about a municipal stormwater permit. So that's why we're talking about perhaps being able to come up with and help you with this additional method of financing this particular kind of infrastructure. Let's see, and then really that's what we're talking about here: environmental impact bonds and pay for success processes. And for that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Todd, who will take us a little bit further into the project and into what these things are all about.
Thanks, Lee. So I'm going to start by introducing the pay for success model. We think that the pay for success model will help communities in the Chesapeake Bay watershed address some of the barriers to deploying GI at scale that Lee was referring to. In a pay for success transaction, private investors provide the upfront capital required for a program or a solution, and the government department responsible for that program repays the investors based on the success of the project as defined by outcome metrics. So what our intentions on this initiative, as Lee mentioned, are to work with 4 communities in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and with you, we would select priority green infrastructure deployments that are at an advanced planning or design stage. And we would work with you and your financial advisors to structure a pay-for-success transaction in a loan or an environmental impact bond, and then issue that financing to enable deployment of the green infrastructure project. And again, the payments from you to the investors for the green infrastructure would be based on the outcomes of the green infrastructure, and with those metrics tied specifically to what you're hoping to achieve with those deployments, related to stormwater management or job creation, or other social, economic, or environmental objectives. And the idea is that if the investors are sharing in the risk of the project and the risk of achieving the outcomes, that'll make it easier and more attractive for you to move forward with the deployment. Next slide. So let's look more closely at this environmental impact bond model and how it works generically and how it would work specifically on this initiative. So I'm going to follow the numbers that are on the slide. So first, Quantified Ventures, we would act as the pay-for-success transaction coordinator, working with you and your financial advisors, and our role is to design and structure the pay-for-success transaction. Chesapeake Bay Foundation, they're the largest nonprofit working to save the Bay. Their role is project management and supporting you and outreach to the public and working with stakeholders, including regulators, and providing guidance on green infrastructure. And together, Quantified Ventures and CBF, we would work with you to bring in the outside investors. And we'll be targeting investors that are referred to as impact investors. And they represent about a $17 billion asset class. And they're mission-focused investors, meaning they want to earn a rate of return on their investments, but they also want to use their money to help achieve important social, environmental, and economic outcomes. And because of that, they're willing to take certain risks on projects. So they would provide the investment capital to the public entity responsible for the green infrastructure, and that department and your community would probably be working with a partner, an engineering firm, or other organization responsible for the implementation. You would have a contract with them to deploy and maintain the green infrastructure using the financing from the impact investors, and the public entity would repay the investors based on achievement of outcome metrics that we would agree in advance. And again, these could be related to stormwater management, job creation, or a range of other health, environmental, or economic objectives. The evaluator, which is that party in the middle of the 3 arrows, their role is to validate that the outcomes have been achieved. And if they validate achievement of outcomes, then that triggers payments from the public entity to the investor. So that's how pay-for-success financing works and how we would carry out this project. Next slide. The first example of application of the environmental impact bond model was with the DC Water and Sewer Authority, which I mentioned earlier. So Quantified Ventures worked with DC Water to structure and issue a $25 million municipal bond to fund a 20-acre green infrastructure deployment in DC. And it was the first municipal bond in which payments to the investors were actually based on the outcomes of the project. So DC Water, you may know, operates a combined sewer system, and because of that, they face significant challenges of managing combined sewer overflows. About 10 years ago, they entered into a consent decree requiring that they implement a range of measures and projects to address their combined sewer overflow challenges. And that consent decree required a multi-billion-dollar expenditure focused on building 3 tunnels. A couple of years ago, the consent decree was amended, enabling implementation of green infrastructure on about 350 acres of land in place of one of the tunnels that previously had been required. But DC Water was worried about moving forward with such a large-scale deployment of green infrastructure. They were worried, would it really work? Would it reduce the volume of stormwater runoff required to address their CSO challenges? So they decided to address that concern about risk by doing 2 things. First, they started with a pilot. So they built green infrastructure on 20 acres initially instead of 350. And they financed that 20-acre deployment using the pay-for-success model that I've been describing. So that financing, the interest payments to the investors are specifically tied to the success of the green infrastructure in reducing the volume of stormwater runoff. So that was the outcome metric around which they based their environmental impact bond. And specifically, the interest payments will fall in one of 3 performance tiers. If the performance is as predicted, then DC Water will pay an amount of interest that's close to their normal cost for borrowing. So if the project is successful, as projected, they'll pay pretty close to what they would normally pay for a municipal bond. However, if the green infrastructure performs below expectations, then the investors will get about 0% interest. And conversely, if the green infrastructure overperforms, then the investors will earn a premium payment. But in that instance, DC Water will know that the green infrastructure overperforms and they may not need to deploy on all of the 350 acres, and therefore they would save money. You can see on the quote here from Bethany Bezak, the GI program manager in DC, what DC felt that they got out of the environmental impact bond. Essentially, they were buying an insurance policy to help them hedge against the risk of the green infrastructure failing and DC therefore wasting a bunch of money. I'll pause at this moment. I think there's some questions coming in. Lee, is there a question that you want me to address at this stage?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. We do have the first question actually that has come in, and basically someone is asking about what would happen in an instance where we're not dealing with a wonderfully sophisticated large city agency, large city municipal utility like DC Water. We're talking about a small town or a medium-sized city, and would something like this work in that kind of a setting? So could you speak to that, please, Todd?
Sure. So I think small towns are also really sophisticated, but there's definitely different requirements for large versus small, or communities that have an MS4 versus a combined sewer system. And I would say that the DC Water Environmental Impact Bond is more of a framework that we can use for designing similar bonds in the future. It's not a detailed recipe. So it's applicable to jurisdictions that have other regulatory requirements. The financing could be structured as a loan and not a municipal bond if a loan fits better with the financing strategy of the jurisdiction we're working in. The amount borrowed can be much less than 25 million, as little as 5 million would be viable. And the outcome metrics around which the financing is designed can be different. They can be selected based on what the jurisdiction wants to achieve. So in DC, it's stormwater volume reduction. In a different community, the success of the project could be defined differently.
Great, thank you, Todd. Again, folks, if you do have questions, just shoot them our way through the chat box, and we'll try to handle them a little bit later in this presentation. So let's go through here. Second part of the agenda is really why is it important for my jurisdiction to apply for this assistance? And again, I'm going to go back to Todd for a little bit and have him explain that.
Thanks, Lee. If you go to the next slide. So what's in it for your jurisdiction? I mean, fundamentally, what we're hoping to achieve is enabling you to deploy green infrastructure, make it easier for you to deploy GI at scale, which will result in a cleaner and healthier community and will help you meet your regulatory obligations. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And over the next 12 to 18 months, we would work with you, your financial advisors, regulators, key stakeholders to structure a financing mechanism that de-risks the project, that passes on some of the risk of the project to impact investors who share your objectives. And we'll de-risk the project by bringing in mission-based investors. They want to earn a rate of return, but they're also interested in the outcomes that green infrastructure can achieve. And potentially we'll also bring in philanthropists who similarly share your objectives and who could provide part of the financing along with the money that's coming from the impact investors. Fundamentally, we want to create a model in which investors are sharing the risk with you, and that makes it easier for you to move forward. It removes some of the barriers that you currently face to moving forward with green infrastructure. The financing mechanism not only would de-risk the project for you, but by tying payments to outcomes, the financing would also help you demonstrate to your communities how green infrastructure supports or delivers certain outcomes. So you would be able to show the relationship between green infrastructure and various stormwater management objectives, job creation, and other social, health, or environmental objectives that are important to you. And hopefully by showing that link to the achievement of specific outcomes, that'll help you generate support for green infrastructure in your communities longer term. Lastly, what's in it for you? The services from Quantified Ventures and Chesapeake Bay Foundation will be provided pro bono or free of charge. So that's what's in it for you. I will hand it back to Lee or to my colleague, Carolyn.
Yeah, Carolyn, why don't you take this? We're going to start talking about how we jurisdictions can apply for this.
Sounds great. Absolutely. I'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of what we're looking for. So as you can see on this slide, these are the main criteria that we're looking for when we're evaluating applications through this process. So at the highest level, we're looking to work with 4 localities, jurisdictions or municipalities over the next 2 years in the Chesapeake Bay watershed in Maryland, Pennsylvania, or Virginia that have some sort of regulatory requirement related to stormwater management. Ideally, we're looking for communities that have green infrastructure projects that are ready to go. And by that, we mean they're in the planning process and that within the next 12 to 18 months, you would be ready to implement those projects, assuming we can help you get that financing lined up and ready to go. And if you have any questions on what ready means, feel free to reach out to our team. We're happy to walk through those with you in more detail. We're also looking for a transaction size that merits going through this process. So as Todd mentioned, DC Water was $25 million. We believe that this model applies to much smaller communities and much smaller transactions. And we've put 3 million here as an initial threshold that we think makes sense in terms of going through the time and effort involved in using this financing approach. Again, if you have any questions on that, let us know. But I should note that this could be one project that you want to do, or a bundle of projects that you would use this financing mechanism for. And those can all fall within that same transaction. We're also looking for projects that demonstrate benefits to disadvantaged communities. One of the things we're really excited about with green infrastructure is all of the co-benefits that do exist related to public health, access to open space, community beautification, economic development, jobs. So we'll encourage you through the application process to highlight where you believe those benefits may be connected to the projects you're proposing. And then finally, we'll be evaluating financial considerations related to the application. So that's both your jurisdiction's financial characteristics like debt capacity and credit rating, as well as looking to make sure that there is a dedicated repayment pool. So that could either be a revenue stream like a stormwater fee that can help repay this bond, or that there's an earmarked pool of capital within your budget or another area that will be used for repayment. And that's really to make sure investors feel comfortable that their investment will be paid back according to the details of the arrangement. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit specifically about the application. So this basically just demonstrates what I have just walked through with criteria, and this is what we'll ask you to outline in your application. The application itself should be live by tomorrow, and we'll follow up with everyone that joined on this webinar with that document. You'll find it on the website that's listed at the bottom of this page, and we welcome you to keep visiting that website for the most recent information. So we'll be asking you to submit a document that outlines first an executive summary of what you're hoping to do in collaboration with our teams, the project scope and fit with the environmental impact bond model. And there's additional questions in there that will help you address that fit question. But that's basically what's the project that you're trying to put in the ground, or the projects that you're trying to put in the ground. We'll have you also discuss jurisdictional capabilities related to financials and your planning resources, projects that you've already implemented. Regulatory and ancillary benefits of the project. So again, we're really interested in both how this helps you meet your regulatory requirements, as well as other benefits that your community may achieve through this project being deployed. And then finally, we'll have an appendix section where you can provide additional detail on the projects that you're proposing, as well as letters of support and any other information. And I want to note here that we're not expecting you to have all of the relevant stakeholders for this project signed on the dotted line and totally agreed to do this financing together beforehand, because we realize it's a short application timeframe. But we are looking for you to demonstrate that you've started to have those conversations. Those stakeholders are broadly on board. And part of the work that we would do with these communities is making sure everyone's aligned and we have everyone at the table that needs to be at the table in terms of executing a successful transaction and getting these projects deployed. I'll note again, as Lee would have me do, that the localities that we're working with will have their own bond counsel and municipal advisor. And we'll really be working with CBF primarily on helping you figure out what the right scope of the transaction is, bringing in the right stakeholders, determining the right outcome metrics, and all of that. So there will be a great group of partners involved in this project. In terms of the timeline, the deadline is October 31st, but we do encourage you to let us know by email or phone by October 11th if you're planning to apply. And just generally, please take the approach of it being an open line of communication with our team. We really want to be a resource to you and help you think through what's the most appropriate project or set of projects. We're there to be to have some of those conversations with stakeholders if you need them to explain this approach and this model. We really want to be a resource to you and your community as you put together this application. So please do reach out to us with any questions that you have. And with that, I will hand it back over to Lee to get into the question section.
Thank you much, Carolyn. All right. Well, what I think I'm going to do here, we put aside some questions here that we are frequently asked about this kind of financing and this kind of project. I'm going to go through a few of those, and then we'll handle a couple that have come in over the transom. So the first is if I've already got access to low-cost capital, what will this kind of a project provide us? And I mean, the answer really is that this allows you to work on innovative projects, the kind of thing that you might not think you should be doing or can do, because you'll be able to share the financial risk of doing so with private investors. And that's a real advantage. Can this kind of a funding model work for CSO projects as well as MS4s? For MS4s, and the answer is yes. As you saw, the very first EIB implemented in the country was in DC, and it was a CSO oriented project. So yeah, the answer is yes. But there needs, of course, to be something driving that, like a consent decree, for example, or the regulatory requirement. And there needs to be a firm repayment source. Is this a P3? We get that question all the time, a public-private partnership, because especially in Dillon rule states, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, localities can only do the things that they are specifically empowered to do by law. And some of them may not have been yet empowered to do P3 projects. And that's the case, for example, in Pennsylvania. But the answer is no, this is not a P3. This is not a public-private partnership. This is just a way to finance infrastructure that you would be financing in some other way. You can use your current procurement methods, your current financing methods, and I don't think we need to worry whether this is a P3 or not. Can I propose more than one project, and if so, how many? I think Carolyn might have mentioned, but if she didn't, she did mention the sort of amount of money that we're looking at here to kind of justify going forward with this. But that's not just necessarily one project. It could be a whole group of projects that you bring together in a portfolio, and that's what adds up to the approximately $3 million or more worth of work that you need to get done. Couple more questions that we get asked. Can I propose something not green infrastructure? The answer to this question, unfortunately, is no. That's what this project's all about. We're trying to promote it. We're trying to, we think it's a good way to get stormwater impacts reduced. And, you know, this is an experiment, but we think it's going to go pretty well. So that's our target. But it is a way also to get to these other co-benefits, as we've said a couple times in this webinar. It can help with flood control. It can help with achieving climate resiliency goals. It can provide additional local employment and economic development. So there are other things that you can be trying to achieve, but through the use of green infrastructure. How will the performance be measured? Again, as Todd said, we're not involved in the measurement. We'll help you choose a third-party evaluator that will independently measure the results of the projects. And he or she or the company that does that will be looking at the metrics that are jointly decided upon and the outcomes that we jointly come up with to see if how well those outcomes are being achieved. Finally, on the frequently asked questions, can I propose a project where another group is the payor, such as a water authority? And the answer is yes. The payer just needs to be creditworthy, and it needs to have a dedicated stream of income or a dedicated repayment source of some kind. But other than that, there's surely no problem with that. So a couple of questions have come in, and I want to try to answer them. We got a question earlier from Pennsylvania, and basically along these lines, Pennsylvania is a Dillon Rule state. Are municipalities prohibited from engaging private contractors to build stormwater on public land? How about private land? And as a general rule, the answer is no. Municipalities have that authority. They always have had that authority to hire private contractors to build infrastructure. They have to go through their normal procurement methods to do it. And for the purposes of our project, most municipalities in Pennsylvania also have the authority to publicly finance those kinds of projects, including through an instrument like an environmental impact bond. Now that doesn't apply to everyone. It's not all municipalities. So whether a municipality needs extra authority, we would count on our partnering pilot municipalities to make sure from their own legal counsel whether they have that authority, and if not, what they need to do to get it. But basically, they, for the most part, have that authority. And as far as whether they can do it on private land, I really can't say. Haven't looked into it, and we really don't know the answer to that question. And the lawyers among us will know that I have to say this is not legal advice. We cannot provide you with legal advice. So on any issues of legal authority, et cetera, you need to get your own counsel looking into this. Okay, another question. Let's see, what do we got here? Okay. How does this apply to an MS4 that requires nutrient reduction versus volume reduction? How do you set the baselines and exceed the thresholds? It's harder, but it's not impossible. We expect that there's going to be some time before this stuff gets deployed, so that there might be an opportunity to monitor the watershed, the small watershed where that green infrastructure is being deployed, to find out what the baseline is, and then use an appropriate green infrastructure practice that is appropriate to the nutrients that you want to try to remove from the effluent, and then monitor afterward. That's what the evaluator's job is. So it's not impossible. There are some difficulties in some states in the watershed because of the way they measure the benefits from BMPs, from the best management practices that are used. And they only attribute a particular amount of credit to a particular type of BMP. But there are ways to get around that, and we can talk about that as we move forward with your projects. Let's see. Okay, which one is that? Okay, here's another one. Oh yeah, shouldn't the actual rate of the debt repayment go actually down with success? That is, isn't it an altruistic investor who is willing to take a lower payout if a project is more successful? And I'm going to turn this over to Todd. The hard questions are all going to go to Todd. So Todd or Carolyn, if you could please address that.
I appreciate that, Lee. Thank you. So the investor is agreeing to a lower interest rate in the case of poor performance, because that's the risk protection that they're providing to the community. So if the green infrastructure fails, then the community would have wasted a bunch of money. But by only being obligated to pay the investor a lower return, effectively it's wasting less money. You know, so the investor is taking on some of that loss. So that's the risk protection. In the case of higher performance, in the DC water example, that one was designed so that the investor earned a premium return, and basically that, you know, they got the potential for a premium return in exchange for taking on the possibility of losing money in the case of poor performance. DC was willing to accept that because, again, this was a pilot. This was a 20-acre deployment as part of a larger 350-acre project. And they knew that even if they would pay the investors more, they would get that money back and a lot more by knowing that they would only need, you know, less than the 350 acres. So that's how that transaction was designed. What we've been thinking for the next round of environmental impact bonds is that we could bring in philanthropic organizations who could provide a loss guarantee for the investor. So in the instance of poor performance, instead of the investors getting a 0% interest rate, the philanthropic organizations would pay that amount to the investors. So they would cover that, you know, that amount for the community. So the community would still get the benefit. The philanthropic organizations would pay that for them. And by doing that, we could do away with that overperformance tier. So potentially there wouldn't be a premium payment required if we had a philanthropic organization in there providing that loss guarantee.
All right, thanks, Todd. Two other questions on the finance side. One is not really the finance side, and that's who pays the evaluator. And I think I know the answer to this question, but Carolyn and Todd, correct me if I'm wrong. The municipality pays that. The municipality is responsible really for the normal expenses of running its operation, and is responsible for planning the green infrastructure, for getting an engineering firm or designing it itself, and for hiring the people to put it into the ground. And the evaluator is part of this project, and I expect that that's the answer. But Todd, tell me if I'm wrong.
That's right, Lee. Just to add, the municipality could include the cost of the evaluator in the financing. So that could be one of the components of the overall implementation that would be financed by the private investor.
Another question from I think the same source is, are EIBs tax exempt?
So the DC Water EIB was a tax exempt municipal bond, and that bond established the legal precedent or authority for EIBs to be tax exempt municipal bonds. But again, we would have to look at, working with you and your financial advisors to understand the local context and figure out what's going to work, for the 4 jurisdictions who we're supporting.
Here's a question I think I can answer. if properly designed, basically, what is the risk of a green infrastructure project? And I think the answer to that is there isn't that much risk. We don't think there's that much risk. And that's, in fact, why there are billions of dollars worth of investors lined up to invest in these kinds of projects. But nevertheless, there is a perceived risk, and depending on how well it's built and where it's put and all kinds of other attributes, there is still some risk. Question came in, how would a bond like this compare with a bond that would be issued by Penvest, which is a financing facility, quasi-public financing facility in Pennsylvania? I don't have the answer to that myself. I don't know if Todd or Carolyn know, but if they don't, we can probably get back to this person. Do you know Todd or Carolyn?
I don't. So let's explore that and come back.
We will. We will get back to you directly. Is that it? All right. Well, I think we've been through the questions, and I really appreciate your participation by giving us some tough ones. Let's see. So at this point, we're pretty much done with our webinar. I will say it might be a little bit ambitious for us to say that the application will be going live tomorrow on our website. We hope that's the case, but we just don't know for sure. But we will send it directly by email to everyone who has registered for this webinar. So at least those who participated will get it right away. And others will need to wait a couple of days, and probably. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We've enjoyed doing this webinar, and we hope you've gotten something out of it. We hope that some of you or many of you will actually apply for this assistance, and we'd be really excited to work with you on it. If you have any questions at all, feel free to send them our way. Here are our email addresses, mine and my companion here at CBF, John Campagna. And the folks at Quantified Ventures are all prepared to help you through this process and answer any questions that you have. We might even be willing to come out and talk to you if that's what it takes. So please do feel free to get in touch with us. And go on our website. There's some stuff up there now, and we'll be populating it as this project proceeds. The website is www.cbf.org/EIB. And I think that's it. And I thank you so much for participating today. Take care, everybody.